In the summer of 1480, one of history's most remarkable military defenses unfolded on the Mediterranean island of Rhodes. A force of approximately 900 Knights Hospitaller, supported by a few thousand local militia and mercenaries, faced an Ottoman invasion force that numbered somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 men. The disparity in numbers was staggering, the outcome seemingly predetermined. Yet when the Ottoman forces finally withdrew in August of that year, the Knights still held their fortress, and Rhodes remained unconquered. This siege represents far more than a simple military victory against overwhelming odds. It stands as a testament to the power of fortification engineering, tactical brilliance, psychological warfare, and the extraordinary resilience of a disciplined military order. The defense of Rhodes would resonate throughout Europe, temporarily halting Ottoman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean and buying Christendom precious time to organize its defenses. To understand how such an improbable victory occurred, we must examine the defenders, their fortifications, their enemies, and the brutal months of siege warfare that tested both sides to their absolute limits. The Knights Hospitaller. Warriors and healers. The Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, commonly known as the Knights Hospitaller, had by 1480 evolved from their origins as caregivers for pilgrims into one of the most formidable military forces in the Mediterranean world. Founded in Jerusalem around 1099 during the First Crusade, the order initially focused on running hospitals and caring for Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. However, the harsh realities of Crusader politics quickly necessitated a military transformation. By the mid-12th century, the Hospitallers had become a military order, though they never abandoned their medical mission. This dual nature would prove crucial to their identity and effectiveness. After the fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader states in the Levant, the Hospitallers relocated first to Cyprus and then, in 1310, to Rhodes. The capture of Rhodes was itself a significant military achievement, requiring years of intermittent warfare against both the Byzantine Greeks, who controlled the island, and Turkish pirates, who used it as a base. By 1480, the Knights had transformed Rhodes into a fortress state. The order was organized along national lines into 8 longs, or tongues: Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, Germany, and Castile. Each long had its own administrative structure and was responsible for defending specific sections of the walls during sieges. The knights themselves represented the elite of European military society. Most came from noble families, and entry into the order required proof of aristocratic lineage. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, though in practice many knights maintained considerable personal wealth and influence. What truly set them apart was their training and discipline. These were professional warriors who had dedicated their lives to military service, and they brought to Rhodes decades of collective combat experience gained from naval warfare against Ottoman and North African corsairs. The Grand Master in 1480 was Pierre d'Aubusson, a French nobleman who had risen through the ranks to become the order's leader in 1476. D'Aubusson would prove to be exactly the kind of leader the situation demanded: intelligent, brave, personally charismatic, and possessed of exceptional organizational skills. He understood both the technical aspects of fortification defense and the psychological dimensions of leadership under extreme pressure. Rhodes. The fortress island Rhodes' strategic importance cannot be overstated. Located just 11 miles from the coast of Anatolia, the island sits at the crossroads of Mediterranean sea routes. Control of Rhodes meant control over shipping lanes between Constantinople, Egypt, and the Levant. For the Knights Hospitaller, Rhodes served as both a base for their continuing war against Islamic naval power and a revenue source through customs duties and piracy. The city of Rhodes, located on the northern tip of the island, had been fortified extensively since the knight's arrival 70 years earlier. The fortifications that would face the Ottoman assault in 1480 represented state-of-the-art defensive military engineering for the late medieval period. The walls of Rhodes enclosed the entire city in a roughly rectangular pattern, approximately 4 kilometers in circumference. These were not simple stone barriers, but complex defensive systems that had evolved through centuries of military architecture. The main walls stood nearly 12 meters high and were reinforced by massive towers at regular intervals. Behind the outer walls lay a second defensive line, creating a defense in depth that would prove crucial during the siege. The Grand Master's palace dominated the city's highest point, serving as both administrative center and final defensive redoubt. The knight's various national houses, the hospital, and the armories were distributed throughout the city according to a plan that maximized defensive efficiency. Each longs was assigned responsibility for a specific section of wall, creating clear lines of command and accountability. The fortifications featured several critical strong points. The Tower of Italy guarded a particularly vulnerable section of wall on the western side. The Jewish quarter's walls on the eastern approaches had been recently reinforced. The harbor was protected by the Tower of St. Nicholas, which controlled the narrow entrance to the port and prevented enemy ships from simply sailing in to attack the city from the sea. D'Aubusson had not been idle during his 4 years as Grand Master before the siege. Recognizing that an Ottoman attack was inevitable, he had invested heavily in improving the fortifications. Walls were thickened, towers reinforced, and stockpiles of food, water, and ammunition built up. The ditches that surrounded the walls were deepened and cleared of any cover that might aid attackers. Buildings that stood too close to the outer walls and might provide cover for enemy forces were demolished. The harbor facilities were crucial to the island's survival. Rhodes depended on maritime trade and military resupply from Europe. The order maintained a powerful galley fleet that could contest Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. These galleys would play a vital role in harassing Ottoman supply lines and maintaining communication with potential allies throughout the siege. The Ottoman threat, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. To understand the Ottoman assault on Rhodes, we must appreciate the ambitions and capabilities of Sultan Mehmed II, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror. By 1480, Mehmed was at the height of his power. He had captured Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and securing the Ottoman position as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. He had conquered Serbia, subdued much of the Balkans, and was actively planning further expansion both westward into Europe and eastward into Persia. Mehmed was not merely a conqueror, but an innovator in military technology and tactics. The siege of Constantinople had demonstrated his willingness to employ the latest developments in artillery, including massive bronze cannons capable of reducing even the strongest medieval fortifications to rubble. Under his rule, the Ottoman military machine had become perhaps the most formidable armed force in the world. The Ottoman army of 1480 was a sophisticated military organization that combined various elements. At its core were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry force, composed of men taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained in specialized military schools. The Janissaries were disciplined, well-equipped, and fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They represented the cutting edge of infantry warfare, armed with firearms as well as traditional weapons. Supporting the Janissaries were various types of provincial cavalry, including the famous Sipahi Lancers, who formed the backbone of Ottoman offensive power in open-field battles. The Ottoman army also included numerous auxiliary troops, engineers, miners, and artillery specialists. This was not a medieval rabble, but a professional military force organized along modern lines with sophisticated logistics and command structures. For his assault on Rhodes, Mehmed assembled a massive invasion fleet and army. The exact numbers remain disputed by historians, with contemporary sources often exaggerating figures. However, modern estimates suggest an invasion force of approximately 70,000 to 100,000 men, supported by a fleet of over 160 ships, including galleys, transport vessels, and specialized ships carrying the siege artillery. The commander chosen for this operation was Messi Pasha, himself a member of the Palaiologos family, the last dynasty to rule Byzantium. His selection carried symbolic weight. A Greek Christian who had converted to Islam, commanding Ottoman forces against Christian knights. Messi Pasha was an experienced general who had served Mehmed well in previous campaigns, but he would face challenges in this siege that would test his abilities to their limits. The opening moves, May 1480. The Ottoman fleet appeared off Rhodes on May 23, 1480. The sight must have been terrifying for the defenders. Hundreds of ships stretching across the horizon, their sails filling the sea between Rhodes and the Anatolian coast. As the ships drew closer, they began landing troops at various points around the island. Grand Master d'Aubusson had prepared as well as circumstances allowed. He had ordered all civilians from the countryside into the city, bringing with them whatever supplies they could carry. Fields were burned to deny the Ottomans food, and wells outside the walls were poisoned or filled in. The knights could not prevent the Ottomans from landing, but they could make their occupation of the island as difficult as possible. The initial Ottoman strategy was to establish a complete blockade of the city while preparing their siege lines. They set up camps at multiple points around the walls, with the main encampment established to the southwest of the city, where the terrain favored artillery positions. Ships blockaded the harbor, though the powerful Tower of St. Nicholas prevented them from entering the port itself. One of the first priorities was moving the siege artillery into position. The Ottomans had brought numerous cannons, including several massive bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing several hundred pounds. These weapons represented the ultimate in 15th century military technology. At Constantinople 27 years earlier, similar artillery had reduced walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. The positioning of these guns was itself a major engineering undertaking. The largest cannons weighed several tons and required specially constructed platforms to absorb their tremendous recoil. Ottoman engineers worked for days preparing firing positions, building earthwork fortifications to protect the gun crews, and stockpiling ammunition. Meanwhile, the defenders were not idle. D'Aubusson organized daily meetings with his council of senior knights to coordinate the defense. Supplies were inventoried and rationed. Every able-bodied person in the city, including women and children, was assigned tasks: maintaining the walls, moving ammunition, caring for the wounded, or preparing food. The hospital facilities of the order were expanded to handle the casualties that were certain to come. The Grand Master also instituted strict discipline. Desertion or cowardice would be punished by death. But he also understood the importance of morale. He made a point of personally visiting every section of the walls daily, speaking with knights and common soldiers alike, ensuring that everyone understood their critical role in the defense. On the psychological front, d'Aubusson ordered that no one was to speak of surrender or even mention the possibility of defeat. Optimism was to be maintained at all costs. He also sent messages to Europe via ships that managed to slip through the Ottoman blockade, calling for reinforcements and supplies. While he could not know if or when help might arrive, the knowledge that Europe was aware of their situation helped maintain morale. The artillery duel, June 1480. The bombardment began in early June, The Ottoman cannons opened fire on the walls with a roar that could be heard across the entire island. The massive stone balls struck the fortifications with tremendous force, and within hours, visible damage had been done. Stone chips flew like shrapnel, and clouds of dust rose from impact points. For the defenders, the bombardment was a test of nerves as much as fortifications. The psychological effect of sitting behind walls while ton-heavy projectiles slammed into them cannot be understated. Men who had never experienced sustained artillery fire found themselves flinching at every discharge, unable to eat or sleep properly as the bombardment continued day after day. However, the fortifications of Rhodes proved more resilient than the Ottomans might have hoped. The walls had been designed with artillery in mind. They were extremely thick, and behind the outer stone facing was a core of rubble and earth that absorbed impact energy rather than shattering like solid masonry. When sections of wall were damaged, work crews would venture out at night to make repairs, piling earth and stones to shore up weak points. The defenders also had artillery of their own, though fewer and generally smaller than the Ottoman guns. These were positioned along the walls and in the towers, and they maintained a steady counter-battery fire. While they could not match the Ottoman artillery piece for piece, they made the work of the Ottoman gun crews dangerous. Crews working the massive bombards, which required hours to reload and re-aim between shots, were vulnerable to this defensive fire. One tactic the defenders employed effectively was the use of incendiary projectiles. Clay pots filled with naphtha, sulfur, and other flammable materials would be lit and launched from catapults toward Ottoman positions. When these shattered, they spread flames that could quickly get out of control, especially in the wooden structures of siege camps. The Tower of Italy became a particular focus of Ottoman attention. This large tower guarded a section of wall that the Ottoman commanders had identified as potentially vulnerable. Day after day, the bombardment concentrated on this area. The tower itself, a massive stone structure rising high above the walls, became pockmarked with impacts. Large sections of facing stone were blown away, revealing the rubble core beneath. Yet the tower did not fall. Each night, work parties would repair what damage they could. More importantly, the knights defending the tower maintained their posts despite the danger. Pierre d'Aubusson made a point of visiting the Tower of Italy regularly, personally encouraging the defenders and demonstrating that he would share their dangers. By the end of June, the Ottomans had succeeded in creating several breaches in the outer walls, but none were yet large enough or in sufficiently defensible positions to risk an assault. Messi Pasha faced a dilemma. The bombardment was consuming vast amounts of gunpowder and wearing out his artillery. The massive bombards, in particular, had a limited number of shots before they risked catastrophic failure. Each firing generated tremendous heat and stress on the metal, and cracks could develop without warning. The first assaults, July 1480. In early July, judging that sufficient damage had been done, Messi Pasha ordered the first major infantry assault. The attack was preceded by an even more intense bombardment than usual, designed to keep the defenders' heads down and prevent them from manning the walls effectively. As the guns fell silent, thousands of Ottoman troops surged forward. The assault concentrated on the areas where breaches had been created, particularly near the Tower of Italy. The attackers came in waves, carrying scaling ladders, siege bridges, and fascines, bundles of sticks that could be thrown into ditches to create crossings. The defenders' response was devastating. As the Ottomans approached, every defensive weapon at the knights' disposal was brought to bear. Crossbows and early firearms poured missiles into the packed ranks of attackers. Stones and timber were dropped from the walls onto men trying to climb. Cauldrons of boiling water, heated oil, and quicklime were dumped onto soldiers in the ditches below. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. Ottoman troops who managed to reach the walls found themselves fighting armored knights in hand-to-hand combat. The knights, though vastly outnumbered, had significant advantages in this type of fighting. Their armor provided excellent protection against most weapons, and their training emphasized close combat with sword and mace. The assault lasted for hours, with the Ottomans feeding fresh troops into the attack to maintain pressure. But the defenses held. At the breaches, temporary barricades of timber and earth had been erected behind the broken walls, creating new defensive lines. The depth of the fortifications meant that even where the outer wall was compromised, the defenders had fallback positions. As evening approached, Messi Pasha called off the assault. The Ottomans withdrew, leaving hundreds of dead in the ditches and approaches to the walls. The defenders had also taken casualties, but proportionally far fewer. More importantly, they had demonstrated that breaches in the walls did not automatically mean Ottoman victory. That night, as work parties on both sides cleared bodies and made repairs, the mood in Rhodes was cautiously optimistic. They had survived the first serious test. D'Aubusson used the victory to bolster morale, praising the defenders' courage and suggesting that the Ottomans might lack the will to persist. Several more assaults followed over the next weeks, each following a similar pattern: bombardment, mass infantry attack, and eventual repulse. The pattern became almost routine, though no less deadly. The Ottomans varied their tactics, trying night attacks, simultaneous assaults at multiple points, and feints designed to draw defenders away from the actual main attack. Each assault claimed lives on both sides, and the casualty toll mounted steadily. Mining and countermining. The underground war. As the surface assaults repeatedly failed, the Ottomans turned to another siege technique: mining. Ottoman engineers began digging tunnels toward the walls, intending to place gunpowder charges under the fortifications and literally blow them up from below. Mining was a standard siege technique, but it was laborious, dangerous work. Miners would dig narrow tunnels, shoring up the roof with timber as they went. The tunnels had to be deep enough to avoid detection, but shallow enough to be effective when the charges detonated. The work was claustrophobic and terrifying, with constant risk of collapse. The defenders knew that mining operations were underway, though detecting the exact locations of tunnels was difficult. Medieval siege defenders employed several techniques to locate mines. The most common was to place bowls of water on the ground. The vibrations from digging would cause ripples. Experts would place their ears to the ground, listening for the sounds of digging. Some defenders even employed trained animals whose superior hearing might detect underground activity. Once a mine was suspected, the defenders would begin countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the enemies. When two tunnels met underground, brutal fighting would erupt in the dark, confined spaces. These underground battles were perhaps the most terrifying aspect of siege warfare. Men fought in pitch blackness with knives and short weapons, often unable to see their enemies until they were literally within touching distance. The knights employed Greek fire, an incendiary weapon whose exact composition remains uncertain, but likely included naphtha, quicklime, and sulfur, in the tunnels. They would blow this liquid fire through copper pipes into enemy mines, creating infernos in the confined spaces that would kill miners and collapse tunnels. In several cases, the knights succeeded in breaking into Ottoman mines before the charges could be set and killing the miners. In others, they identified mine locations early enough to dig counter-tunnels that diverted the explosive force away from the walls. The underground war became a deadly game of three-dimensional chess, with both sides trying to outthink and outmaneuver the other. Despite these efforts, several Ottoman mines did reach their targets and detonate. The explosions were tremendous, shaking the entire city and throwing up huge clouds of dust and debris. In several cases, significant sections of wall collapsed, creating new breaches that had to be frantically fortified before the Ottomans could exploit them. The most dangerous mine detonation occurred in mid-July, when an Ottoman mine under the Jewish quarters wall exploded with tremendous force. The blast collapsed a large section of wall and killed several defenders instantly. Ottoman troops rushed toward the breach, hoping to exploit the opening before the defenders could react. What followed was some of the most intense fighting of the entire siege. The knights and local defenders poured into the breach area, desperate to prevent Ottoman troops from gaining a foothold inside the walls. D'Aubusson himself led the counterattack, fighting in the rubble with sword and shield. The Grand Master's personal courage in this moment was crucial. Seeing their leader fighting alongside them, the defenders rallied and managed to contain the penetration. The fighting around this breach continued for most of a day, with neither side willing to yield. Finally, as darkness fell and Ottoman casualties mounted, Messi Pasha ordered another withdrawal. The breach remained, but the Ottomans had failed to exploit it, and overnight the defenders erected new barricades to seal the gap. The crisis. Late July 1480. By late July, the situation for the defenders was becoming desperate. Casualties had been heavy, and every knight and soldier was exhausted from the constant fighting, repair work, and watch duty. Food supplies, while not yet critical, were being depleted faster than expected because the garrison was expending so many calories in the constant physical labor of defense. Medical supplies were running low, and the hospitals were overflowing with wounded. Morale remained surprisingly good, largely due to D'Aubusson's leadership, but cracks were beginning to show. There had been no word from Europe, no sign that relief forces were being assembled. The defenders began to wonder if they had been abandoned, left to face the might of the Ottoman Empire alone. The Ottomans, however, were facing their own problems. Casualties among the assault troops had been horrific. Disease was beginning to spread through their camps, as it inevitably did in any prolonged siege where thousands of men were camped in close quarters with poor sanitation. Supplies were also becoming an issue. While the Ottoman fleet theoretically controlled the sea, Knights Hospitaller galleys based on other islands were conducting effective raids on supply ships, and several major resupply convoys had been intercepted or forced to turn back. The political situation was also changing. In August, in Siwar, news reached the Ottoman camp that Muhammad had launched another military campaign, this time directed toward southern Italy. Ottoman forces had landed at Otranto on the Italian peninsula and seized the city. This created a strategic dilemma for Messi Pasha. The campaign in Italy might require reinforcements drawn from the army besieging Rhodes. More immediately, the Ottoman commanders were beginning to doubt whether Rhodes could be taken at acceptable cost. They had lost thousands of men without achieving their objective. Every assault had been repulsed, and the defenders showed no signs of weakening. The siege equipment was wearing out, particularly the artillery, and there was a limited supply of gunpowder and ammunition. The final assault. August 1480. In late July or early August, sources differ on the exact date, Messi Pasha decided to launch one final all-out assault. He would throw every available man into a simultaneous attack at multiple points on the walls, hoping that sheer numbers and determination would overwhelm the exhausted defenders. It was a desperate gamble, but the alternative was to admit failure and withdraw. The final assault was preceded by the most intense bombardment of the entire siege. For an entire day and night, Ottoman artillery pounded the walls without pause. The noise was so overwhelming that defenders reportedly could not hear themselves think, and several men were driven temporarily mad by the sensory overload. When the assault came, it involved possibly 30,000 to 40,000 men attacking simultaneously at multiple points around the perimeter. The Ottomans employed every siege technique simultaneously: scaling ladders, siege towers, mine explosions, and diversionary attacks. The objective was to spread the defenders so thin that somewhere, somehow, a breakthrough would occur. For several hours, the outcome hung in the balance. At multiple points, Ottoman troops managed to gain toeholds on the walls or penetrate through breaches. The fighting was hand-to-hand, absolutely savage, with no quarter given on either side. D'Aubusson, now wounded in several places from previous fighting, again led counterattacks personally, rallying defenders at critical points. The crucial moment came at the Tower of St. Nicholas, guarding the harbor entrance. A large force of Ottoman troops managed to fight their way onto the tower's lower levels. If they could secure the tower and open it to Ottoman ships, the entire defensive position would be compromised. The Grand Master, despite his injuries and exhaustion, led a desperate counterattack into the tower. The fighting inside was particularly brutal, taking place on narrow stairs and in confined rooms where the knights' superior armor and close combat training gave them crucial advantages. After what must have seemed like an eternity, the Ottomans were driven from the tower. Across the rest of the perimeter, similar scenes played out. Wherever Ottoman troops penetrated, they were met by fierce counterattacks that drove them back. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nowhere to retreat. That failure meant death or enslavement for themselves and everyone in the city. As evening approached, it became clear that the assault had failed. Ottoman commanders began pulling back their troops, and the attacks gradually subsided. The Ottomans had suffered enormous casualties, possibly several thousand killed and wounded in a single day, without achieving any lasting success. The siege lifted. August 1480. In the days following the failed final assault, morale in the Ottoman camp collapsed. The troops, who had endured months of siege warfare with little to show for it, were on the verge of mutiny. Disease continued to spread, and supply problems worsened. News from Italy suggested that the campaign there was also not going well. Messi Pasha faced reality. He could not take Rhodes, at least not with the forces and resources currently available. To continue the siege would merely waste lives and resources that the Sultan needed elsewhere. Sometime in mid to late August 1480, again, sources differ on exact dates, he gave the order to withdraw. The Ottoman fleet began the process of re-embarking the army. This was a complex and vulnerable operation, as the defenders could potentially sally forth to attack troops while they were boarding ships. However, D'Aubusson, perhaps recognizing that his own forces were too exhausted for offensive operations, or perhaps simply willing to let the enemy depart, did not interfere. Over several days, the Ottoman army left Rhodes. They left behind their siege works, destroyed artillery that was too damaged to move, and thousands of graves. The fleet sailed north toward Anatolia, leaving Rhodes still in the hands of the Knights Hospitaller. As the last Ottoman sails disappeared over the horizon, the defenders of Rhodes allowed themselves to celebrate. They had achieved the impossible. Against odds that any rational military analysis would have deemed insurmountable, they had held their fortress. The city was damaged, the walls were pockmarked and breached in several places. Casualties had been heavy, and supplies were nearly exhausted. But Rhodes remained unconquered. Analysis. Why did the defense succeed? The successful defense of Rhodes against overwhelming odds resulted from multiple factors working in concert. No single element can fully explain the outcome. Rather, it was the combination of advantages, decisions, and circumstances that produced victory. First and foremost were the fortifications themselves. The walls of Rhodes represented sophisticated military engineering that incorporated centuries of defensive evolution. The thickness of the walls, the depth of the defenses, and the careful positioning of strong points all contributed to making the city extremely difficult to assault successfully. Even when breaches were created, the defense in depth meant that attackers faced new defensive lines rather than immediate access to the city interior. Leadership was crucial. Pierre d'Aubussan's combination of strategic intelligence, tactical skill, and personal courage provided exactly what the defenders needed. His willingness to share the dangers of the common soldier, his attention to morale, his organizational abilities, and his calm under pressure all contributed immeasurably to the defense. In contrast, while Messi Pasha was a competent commander, he faced the nearly impossible task of coordinating a massive assault force engaged in one of the most difficult types of military operations, a siege against prepared, motivated defenders. The training and discipline of the Knights Hospitaller cannot be understated. These were professional warriors who had devoted their lives to military service. They understood fortification defense, and they had the discipline to maintain their positions even under the most trying circumstances. The organization of the order into langus, each responsible for specific wall sections, created clear lines of authority and accountability that proved crucial in the chaos of battle. Morale and motivation heavily favored the defenders. The knights were fighting for their home, their order, and their religion. They knew that defeat meant death or slavery. This existential motivation generated a level of commitment that attackers, even well-trained janissaries, could not match. The Ottomans, while professionally competent, were fighting in someone else's country for goals that, while important, did not involve their immediate survival. The defensive advantage in siege warfare of this era was also significant. Attackers had to expose themselves to approach fortifications, climb walls under fire, and fight in conditions where all advantages of terrain and position favored defenders. Even with significant numerical superiority, translating numbers into effective combat power during an assault was extremely difficult. Ottoman logistical challenges played a role. Maintaining a force of 70,000 to 100,000 men on an island required constant resupply by sea. The Knights' naval forces, though smaller than the Ottoman fleet, were able to interdict some of these supplies and make the logistics situation more difficult. Disease, always a factor in siege warfare, weakened the besieging force over time. The relatively new technology of artillery had not yet completely revolutionized siege warfare. While Ottoman cannons could damage walls, the fortifications of Rhodes could be repaired quickly enough to prevent the kind of total wall collapse that would make the city indefensible. The artillery of 1480 occupied a transitional moment in military technology, powerful enough to threaten traditional fortifications, but not yet overwhelming enough to make them obsolete. Finally, strategic considerations influenced the outcome. The Ottoman Empire, despite its power, was engaged on multiple fronts. Sultan Mehmed's invasion of Italy, launched during the Siege of Rhodes, meant that resources and attention were divided. Had the empire been able to focus exclusively on Rhodes, the outcome might have been different. Aftermath and historical significance. The successful defense of Rhodes had immediate and lasting consequences. In Europe, the news was greeted with jubilation and relief. After decades of Ottoman expansion that seemed unstoppable, here was proof that determined resistance could succeed. The Knights Hospitaller became heroes throughout Christian Europe, and Pope Sixtus IV ordered celebrations and praised their valor. For Pierre d'Aubusson personally, the victory brought fame and honor. He was elevated to the rank of cardinal, though he continued to serve as Grand Master of the Order. His reputation as a military commander was secured, and he would lead the Knights for another 23 years until his death in 1503. The strategic situation in the eastern Mediterranean stabilized temporarily. The Ottomans, having failed to take Rhodes, could not completely dominate the sea lanes. The Knights continued their operations, raiding Ottoman shipping and coastlines, serving as a persistent thorn in the side of Ottoman power. However, we should not overstate the long-term impact. The Ottoman Empire remained the dominant power in the region, and this defeat, while embarrassing, did not significantly weaken their overall position. In fact, within months of the siege's end, Sultan Mehmed was already planning new campaigns. The defense of Rhodes bought time, but ultimately the knights could not hold the island forever. In 1522, a new sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, would return with an even larger force and conduct an even longer siege. This time, despite another heroic defense, the knights would be forced to surrender and evacuate. They would relocate to Malta, where they would continue their mission, but Rhodes would pass into Ottoman control. Yet the 1480 siege remains significant. It demonstrated that the Ottoman advance was not inevitable, that determined defenders with good fortifications and skilled leadership could resist even overwhelming force. This lesson would inform European defensive strategy for centuries. The military techniques employed, particularly in countermining and the use of artillery in defense, would be studied and refined by later generations. The siege also highlighted the importance of the Knights Hospitaller as defenders of Christian Europe's eastern frontiers. Their dual role as both military force and humanitarian organization gave them unique legitimacy. The hospitals they operated continued to care for the sick and wounded, even during the siege, maintaining the order's founding mission alongside its military functions. Lessons in resilience and military strategy. The Siege of Rhodes offers numerous lessons that extend beyond its immediate historical context. The first is the enduring power of fortification, when properly designed and vigorously defended. Throughout military history, fortified positions have allowed smaller forces to resist larger ones, and Rhodes stands as a classic example of this principle. The siege demonstrates the critical importance of leadership in extreme situations. D'Aubussan's ability to maintain morale, make sound tactical decisions under pressure, and inspire by personal example made the difference between victory and defeat. His leadership reminds us that human factors often outweigh purely material considerations in determining outcomes. The defense also shows the value of preparation and organization. The knights did not simply wait for the Ottomans to arrive. They spent years improving fortifications, stockpiling supplies, and planning their defensive strategy. When the siege came, they had systems in place for command and control, logistics, and medical care. This organizational groundwork proved essential to surviving months of combat. Another lesson concerns the limitations of technological superiority. The Ottomans possessed superior artillery and larger numbers, yet these advantages proved insufficient against determined, well-led defenders fighting from strong positions. Technology can provide advantages, but it does not guarantee victory. The siege reminds us of the human cost of warfare. Thousands died on both sides, many more were wounded, and civilians endured months of terror and privation. The victory, while genuine, came at a tremendous price. The defenders who survived were traumatized and exhausted, and the city they saved was heavily damaged. Finally, Rhodes demonstrates that historical outcomes are not predetermined by material factors alone. On paper, the Ottomans should have won easily. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, better artillery, and the resources of a vast empire behind them. Yet they lost. The combination of intangible factors, morale, leadership, determination, and fighting spirit, proved decisive. Conclusion. The enduring legacy. The Siege of Rhodes in 1480 remains one of history's most remarkable defensive victories. When approximately 900 Knights Hospitaller and a few thousand supporting troops held their fortress against an Ottoman force that may have numbered 100,000, they accomplished something that seemed impossible. The defense succeeded not through any single factor, but through the combination of strong fortifications, brilliant leadership, professional military excellence, high morale, and perhaps a measure of good fortune. The story of Rhodes has endured because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience: the ability of determined people to resist overwhelming odds, the power of courage and skill to overcome material disadvantage, and the capacity for leadership and organization to multiply the effectiveness of limited forces. Pierre d'Aubusson and his knights demonstrated that numbers alone do not determine victory, that fortifications and tactics matter, that leadership can inspire ordinary people to extraordinary efforts, and that even the mightiest empires can be checked by determined resistance. The Knights Hospitaller would eventually lose Rhodes, but not in 1480. For more than 4 decades after this siege, they maintained their presence on the island, a constant challenge to Ottoman ambitions in the Mediterranean. When they finally did leave in 1522, it was with honor, having negotiated terms that allowed them to depart intact and relocate to Malta, where they would continue their unique mission for centuries more. The defense of Rhodes reminds us that history is not merely the story of empires and their expansion, but also the story of those who resist, who stand firm against pressure, who refuse to accept the supposedly inevitable. In an age when the Ottoman Empire seemed unstoppable, the Knights of Rhodes proved that determination, skill, and courage could still prevail. Their story continues to inspire because it represents hope against despair, defiance against overwhelming power, and the triumph of human spirit over material odds. The walls of Rhodes, still standing today, testify to the courage of those who defended them over 5 centuries ago, and their story remains a testament to what dedicated people can achieve when they refuse to surrender.